March, the bank did not simply give Walter 30 days to find money, it gave him 30 days to prove the farm still had a way to make money. That was the difference most people in Cedar County never heard. The letter on his kitchen table said the note was past due, the operating loan was frozen, and the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings unless Walter presented signed purchase agreements, a realistic production plan, and evidence that the farm could generate cash before the end of summer. It was not mercy. It was paperwork. The bank did not believe in crawfish, wet ground, or old notebooks. It believed in collateral, signatures, and dates. So before Walter ever flooded the low field, he spent 3 days driving between seafood restaurants, bait suppliers, and a small distributor, 2 counties south. Most of them laughed him out of the room without laughing out loud. One restaurant owner took his card only because she remembered buying vegetables from his father years ago. The distributor agreed to something smaller than a promise. If Walter could produce live crawfish by late July, at market size, in steady volume, he would buy every sack Walter could legally deliver. Walter carried that unsigned hope back to the bank with muddy boots and a folder full of maps, water records, supplier receipts, and a letter of intent that looked thin enough to tear in half. The loan officer read it twice. He did not smile. He did not congratulate Walter. He tapped the paper with one finger and said the bank would hold action for 90 days, not because the plan looked good, but because a rushed foreclosure in spring would cost them almost as much as waiting until summer. Walter had until August 1st. If the field failed, the sale would move forward before harvest season ended. Walter folded the letter of intent into his notebook and drove home without turning on the radio. By the time he reached the ridge above the farm, the last light was lying flat across the low field behind the barn. The ground looked dark and heavy, the way it always did before spring planting. For 60 years, men in his family had tried to make that field behave. They had drained it, cut it, plowed it, planted it, cursed it, and watched it steal profit, one wet spring and one dry summer at a time. Walter sat in the truck with both hands on the wheel until the engine ticked itself cool. The next morning, he started building levees. When June turned dry, the neighbors saw only water. They drove past the Reed place with dust boiling behind their tires and looked over the fence at 18 acres of shallow, muddy ponds. They saw Walter walking the levee with a shovel over one shoulder. They saw the old pump coughing beside the barn. They saw water shining under a white sky while their corn curled tighter every afternoon. What they did not see was how close that water came to killing everything. By the 3rd week without rain, the pond was no longer the cool, living basin Walter had built in April. It had turned warm and slick at the edges. A sour smell rose from the shallows before sunrise. Crawfish that should have stayed buried began creeping along the muddy banks in the blue hour before morning, their claws raised, their shells dull instead of bright. The water level dropped a finger width each day. In the shallowest corner, Walter found 3 dead ones, floating belly up against a mat of rotting grass. He took off his cap and stood over them without moving. Then he reached down, picked them out one by one, and laid them in the bed of the pickup like evidence. That morning he did not go to town for coffee. He cut willow brush from the creek bank and dragged it into the hottest sections for shade. He opened the north drain just long enough to move stale water through the basin, then shut it before he lost too much depth. He ran the pump in short bursts, never long enough to drain the old well hard, only enough to stir the surface and push oxygen back into the pond. He walked barefoot into the mud because boots pulled too hard and wasted strength. By noon, heat trembled above the levees. Across the road, the Bennett cornfield had gone gray-green. The leaves rolled so tight they looked like wires. Farther west, soybean plants lay flat and dusty, their roots trapped in soil cracked open like broken pottery. Men who had laughed at Walter in April now stood beside their own fields with hands on hips, watching the sky refuse them. But Walter did not have the luxury of feeling proven right. His own crop could die in a single hot night. Every evening, he lowered a white enamel cup into the pond and checked the smell before he checked the level. He watched for crawfish climbing the levees, for minnows gasping near the surface, for bubbles that meant decay was outrunning life. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom and lay instead on the kitchen floor beside the screen door, boots still on, so he could hear the pump if the belt slipped. On the worst night, the air did not cool after sunset. The farmhouse held the heat in its walls. The dog would not leave the porch. Somewhere in the dark, the pump made a dry squeal, then caught again. Walter sat up before he was fully awake. He crossed the yard in his undershirt with a flashlight swinging in one hand and found the belt shuddering on the pulley. The pond lay black beyond him, flat as oil. He shut the engine down, burned his fingers on the housing, wrapped the frayed belt with a strip cut from an old inner tube, and started it again. The pump coughed once, stopped, coughed again. Then water began to move. Walter stood there in the dark, one hand braced against the metal frame, feeling the vibration climb through his bones. He watched the first ripple spread across the pond and catch the moonlight. Only then did he let go. At dawn, the traps were heavier. Not full, not safe, but heavier. He emptied the first one into a crate and saw the crawfish hit the plastic alive, red, angry, and strong. He did not smile. He reset the trap, wiped mud from his wrist, and moved to the next one. The first buyer arrived on a July morning when the county looked beaten. Grass along the road had gone the color of old rope. Cattle stood in the thin shade of hedge trees, tails flicking at flies. The diner sign in town had a handwritten notice taped inside the window because the owner could not get enough crawfish for her weekend boil. 2 farms west of Walter had already chopped their corn for silage, not because it was ready, but because there was no point waiting for grain that would never fill. Walter was already in the field when the restaurant truck rolled down the lane. The driver found him standing knee-deep in water, lifting a trap that bent under its own weight. Crawfish poured into the sorting tray in a hard red tumble. Their claws clicked against metal. Mud ran through the mesh. Walter reached in with both hands, sorted fast, tossed the small ones back, and filled another crate until the plastic handles bowed. The driver stopped near the barn and stared. Walter did not look up until the crate was full. By 8 o'clock, the first stack of sacks sat in the shade beside the leaning barn. By 9, the distributor van had arrived. By 10, 2 neighbors had slowed their trucks on the road and forgotten to pretend they were not watching. Walter weighed each sack on the hanging scale his father had once used for feed. The needle jumped, steadied, and held. The restaurant owner counted the sacks twice. The distributor asked how many more Walter could pull that week. Walter looked across the water before answering. He saw the levees patched with clay. He saw willow brush half submerged in the shallows. He saw the old pump shaking beside the barn, still alive by wire, rubber, and stubbornness. He saw 18 acres of land that had nearly drowned his family in debt finally bringing something back. He told them to come again before sunrise. After that, the laughter in Cedar County thinned out. It did not disappear all at once. Men rarely surrender their certainty that cleanly, but it changed shape. At the feed store, the jokes came softer, then stopped when Walter walked in. At the diner, farmers who had once lowered their voices around him began asking what bait he used, how deep the water ran, and whether clay soil held better than sandy ground. The county agent returned in September with a soil probe and a camera, but this time he walked behind Walter instead of ahead of him. The bank letter came last. Not a threat, not a warning, a revised note. Walter opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where foreclosure papers had sat all spring. He read it once, set it down, and placed his father's notebook on top of it. Outside, the low field had been drawn down for rest. The mud was cracked in places, dark and rich beneath the pale crust. Along the levee, small crawfish chimneys rose like little clay monuments. The barn still leaned. The tractor still smoked. The farmhouse still needed shingles. Nothing had turned perfect, but the farm was still his. One evening, the neighbor who had laughed from the mailbox in April stopped at the gate. He stood there for a long time before asking if Walter would show him where the levee should begin on a wet corner of his own place. Walter picked up his cap from the porch rail. They walked together toward the low field without ceremony, their boots brushing through the late grass. The sun was dropping behind the barn, turning the shallow water copper, where it remained in the deepest cuts. Walter did not give a speech. He did not say the land had been right all along. He did not say patience had won. He stopped at the edge of the basin and pushed his shovel into the mud. The neighbor watched the water rise slowly around the blade. That was answer enough.